They said the girl had no voice, not because her throat was damaged, not because she was mute, but because no one had ever allowed her to speak. For 17 years she lived inside a house that treated silence as law, watching mouths move, hearing orders barked, prayers whispered, screams swallowed, while her own words were locked somewhere deep inside her chest, growing heavier with each passing year. And then one night, as fire climbed the walls and the house began to die screaming, the girl who had never spoken opened her mouth, and what came out changed everything anyone thought they knew about her, about the house, and about the truth that had been buried alive within its walls. Before we go any further, subscribe to History Unmasked, hit the bell icon, and stay with us until the very end. And when the story finishes, leave a comment telling us how deeply it affected you. Because what you are about to hear is not loud history, not heroic history, but the kind that breathes quietly in corners until it becomes impossible to ignore. And it begins with a rule that was never written, never announced, never questioned, yet obeyed more strictly than any law spoken aloud, the rule that the girl was never to speak, not a word, not a sound, not even a breath shaped into meaning. And no one could say exactly when the rule began, only that it had always been there, older than memory, older than the house itself, as if the walls had been built with the understanding already sealed into their timber. The girl arrived before anyone could remember her arriving, brought in not with chains or ceremony, but with the quiet inevitability of an object being placed where it belonged. And from the very first day, she learned that silence was not merely expected of her, but required in the same way the house required order, obedience, and the absence of disturbance. Because when she made her first mistake, a small, frightened sound escaping her mouth as she stumbled on the back steps, time itself seemed to freeze, the adults pausing mid-motion, faces hardening not with anger, but with something colder, something like alarm, and she was taken aside without shouting, without spectacle, taught in calm, measured tones that her voice was not wanted, that it caused problems, that it unsettled people, and though no one used the word dangerous, the meaning pressed against her chest all the same. From that moment forward, silence became her currency, her protection, her burden, because as long as she made no sound, she was allowed to exist at the edges of rooms, at the backs of hallways, at the margins of attention, and the house adapted to her presence the way one adapts to a piece of furniture that cannot be moved, stepping around her, speaking over her, issuing commands with gestures or sharp looks rather than questions, never asking for her thoughts because thoughts implied words, and words were forbidden. As years passed, the rule hardened, reinforced not through constant punishment, but through repetition and fear, through the way conversations stopped when she entered, through the way children were warned not to provoke her into noise, through the way the mistress's eyes narrowed whenever the girl's lips parted even slightly, and so the girl learned discipline beyond her age, holding coughs deep in her throat until her eyes watered, swallowing laughter until it burned, pressing her hand against her mouth when pain flared unexpectedly, and in doing so she learned something else as well, something no one intended to teach her, that silence sharpens awareness, that when you are not allowed to speak you are forced to listen, and listen she did, to everything, to arguments whispered late at night behind doors that were not fully closed, to prayers spoken in desperation rather than faith, to the master's voice changing when he believed no one important was near, to the soft betrayals hidden in everyday routines, and the more she listened, the heavier her silence became, no longer empty but packed tight with words, names, confessions, and fears that had nowhere to go. She slept in a narrow space near the back of the house, where heat lingered and air moved slowly, and at night, when the house settled into its creaks and sighs, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling sentences form inside her mind without sound, full thoughts that pressed against her teeth as if seeking escape, and sometimes she imagined what her voice might sound like if she were ever allowed to use it, whether it would come out weak and broken from disuse or strong from being held so long, and that uncertainty frightened her more than silence itself, because silence at least was familiar. The house, too, seemed to recognize her in ways people did not, its floorboards groaning more loudly beneath her steps, its doors resisting her touch as though it resented the quiet she carried. and there were moments when she felt the walls leaning inward, listening for a sound that never came, and she wondered, in the private space of her thoughts, whether the house itself was waiting for her to break, whether it was holding its breath alongside her, and yet she obeyed, day after day, year after year, growing taller, stronger, more aware, her face settling into an expression of stillness that others mistook for emptiness, because it was easier to believe the silent girl had nothing inside her than to consider the weight of everything she contained. People forgot her easily, forgot she was present, forgot she was human, and in their forgetting they revealed themselves, their truths spilling freely into the quiet space she occupied. And though she did not yet understand why the rule existed, why her voice alone was considered so dangerous, she felt the tension in the house tightening like a drawn wire, every whispered secret adding strain, every unspoken cruelty feeding something unseen, and deep within her, beneath years of discipline and restraint, the words did not fade or soften, they sharpened, aligning themselves patiently, waiting, because silence, when enforced long enough, does not erase what is hidden inside it, it preserves it, and the girl, standing at the center of that preservation, was becoming something the house itself could no longer contain. As the years passed and the girl's silence became not just a rule but a condition of the house itself, the building seemed to grow more aware of her presence, as though it had adjusted its very breathing to match hers, responding to her quiet with sounds of its own, the slow creak of beams at night, the uneven groan of floorboards beneath her bare feet, the faint scratching within the walls that never quite faded, and though no one ever said it aloud, there was an unspoken understanding that the house behaved differently when she moved through it, that doors resisted her hands more stubbornly, that shadows clung longer to her shape, and that rooms felt heavier after she passed, as if something invisible had paused to watch her go. She noticed it first in small ways, the way a hallway that was usually still would suddenly sigh as she crossed it, or how the kitchen fire would snap sharply when she stood too close. And at night, lying awake in her narrow sleeping space, she sometimes felt vibrations through the floor beneath her body, subtle and rhythmic, like a pulse, and she wondered if the house was listening for the sound she was forbidden to make, straining toward it, growing restless in its absence. People, on the other hand, grew careless around her silence, mistaking it for emptiness, and because she never spoke, never interrupted, never reacted in the way they expected, they spoke freely in front of her, voices lowered not out of caution but habit, arguments spilling out in half-formed confessions, grievances aired without fear of being repeated, and she absorbed it all, not because she wished to, but because there was no escape from listening when sound was the O&L. Being she was allowed to receive, she learned the rhythms of the house by ear alone, could tell who was approaching by the weight of their steps, could sense mood shifts by the speed of breathing in the room, and when anger sharpened the air, she felt it before words were spoken, her body reacting instinctively, shoulders tensing, jaw tightening, lips pressing together to hold the silence intact. The mistress spoke most freely when she believed herself alone, pacing the rooms at night, whispering grievances to the walls, to God, to the shadows, and the girl heard every word, the resentment, the fear, the guilt she tried to bury beneath rigid order during the day, and those whispered confessions clung to the girl like smoke, seeping into her thoughts, settling beside the other secrets she carried, while the master's voice, something that would force a release, because silence, when stretched too far, does not simply remain. It transforms, and the house, heavy with secrets and pressure, seemed to be waiting for the moment when listening would no longer be enough. The change did not arrive with a single moment anyone could point to later, no sudden argument or dramatic event that announced itself as the beginning, but rather it crept into the house the way dampness seeps into old wood, quietly, persistently, until everything felt heavier without anyone knowing why, and the girl sensed it long before the others did, because she had learned to read the house the way one reads weather, feeling pressure shifts in the air, sensing when something unseen was gathering strength. It began with the master's sleep, or rather the lack of it, his nights growing restless, his footsteps appearing in the corridors long after the lamps should have been extinguished, pacing back and forth with a candle held too close to his face, muttering words that never fully formed, stopping abruptly outside certain doors as if listening for something that never answered. And when he paused near the girl's sleeping place, she felt it like a tightening around her chest, a sudden awareness that she was being measured, weighed, considered in ways that made her skin prickle, and though he never spoke to her directly, never addressed her at all, his presence lingered longer than it should have, his shadow stretching across the wall like a question without words. The mistress noticed the change too, though she framed it differently, her days growing sharper, her orders more abrupt, her patience thinning until even the smallest mistakes drew a reaction out of proportion. And she began crossing herself more often, especially when passing the darker parts of the house, murmuring prayers not of gratitude but of protection, glancing toward the girl with an expression that mixed suspicion and fear, as if she sensed something building but could not identify its source. The others followed suit, voices lowering, laughter fading, conversations breaking off mid-sentence whenever tension entered the room, and the girl moved through it all like a silent thread stitching the unease together, present at every moment yet acknowledged at none, absorbing the subtle changes, the way doors were locked earlier than usual, the way candles were kept burning longer into the night, the way people hesitated before speaking, as though afraid of being overheard by something more attentive than ears. The house itself seemed to respond to this shift, its sounds growing louder and more erratic, floorboards popping sharply without warning, beams groaning under no visible strain, and at night the girl felt vibrations beneath her body that were no longer rhythmic but uneven, like a heartbeat skipping beats. And sometimes she woke with the sensation that the walls were leaning inward, not collapsing, but listening more intently than ever, as if the building had begun to anticipate something it could not name. Within her, the pressure she had carried for so long began to change as well, no longer a static weight, but a restless force. The words she had stored shifting against one another, rearranging themselves into patterns that felt purposeful, and for the first time, she began to wonder not what her voice might sound like, but what it might do if released, a thought that frightened her enough to clamp down harder on her silence, pressing her lips together until they ached, forcing herself to breathe slowly, deliberately, as she had been taught. Yet the more she restrained herself, the more the tension around her seemed to sharpen, as though the house resented her continued obedience, as though something had reached its limit and was growing impatient. And she began to notice moments when her own emotions seemed to ripple outward, anger causing a sudden draft through the corridor, fear coinciding with the door slamming. Elsewhere in the house, sorrow followed by the dull crack of wood splitting in the night, coincidences too precise to ignore, too frequent to dismiss as chance. People reacted to these moments with unease, exchanging glances, whispering explanations they did not believe, and though no one accused the girl of anything directly, a subtle distance formed around her, a widening gap as if everyone instinctively stepped back, creating space for something they did not understand. And in that space the tension grew, fed by avoidance and fear. The master's nighttime wanderings grew more erratic, his muttering louder, his pauses longer, and once, as he stood near the girl's sleeping place, he spoke her name aloud for the first time in years, the sound rough and uncertain, as if testing whether it still held power, and though she did not respond, did not move, did not even open her eyes, the effect was immediate. A sharp crack echoing through the house, as a beam shifted somewhere above, dust raining down from the ceiling, and the master recoiled as if struck, retreating without another word, leaving behind a silence so thick it felt charged. From that night on, the sense of waiting became unbearable, a drawn-out breath held by everyone and everything under that roof, and the girl felt it most keenly, the words inside her no longer passive, but pressing forward, urging release, not in panic but with certainty, as if they knew their time was approaching, and though she still did not understand the full reason for the rule that bound her, she began to sense its true purpose, not to protect the house from her voice, but to protect it from what her voice might awaken, because the house was no longer merely listening. It was straining toward a breaking point, and she, bound by silence at its center, felt with growing clarity that when the tension finally snapped, it would not do so quietly, and nothing within those walls would remain unchanged. The night it happened did not announce itself with thunder or warning. No omen clear enough for anyone to later claim they had known, because it began like so many others, wrapped in routine and fatigue, the house settling into its familiar groans. As lamps were dimmed and doors secured, yet beneath that surface normality, the tension that had been tightening for weeks felt stretched to a fragile, trembling edge, and the girl sensed it the moment darkness fell, a restlessness moving through the air like static before a storm, making her skin prickle and her breath shallow as she lay awake in her narrow sleeping place, listening not just to footsteps or whispers now, but to something deeper, a subtle crackle beneath the sounds of the house. As if heat were already building somewhere unseen, it began with a smell, faint at first, so easily dismissed that no one noticed until it was too late. A thin thread of smoke curling through the kitchen long after the evening fire should have died, slipping into the corridors and stairwells like a question that demanded an answer, and the girl was the first to recognize it for what it was, because she had lived so long without the distraction of speech that her senses had sharpened beyond intention. And as the scent reached her, she sat upright, heart pounding, knowing with a certainty that bypassed thought that this was not an accident, not merely carelessness or chance, but the release of something that had been waiting. Voices followed soon after, confused shouts echoing through the house as someone discovered, flames licking up the back wall of the kitchen, fire catching hungrily on dry wood, spreading faster than anyone expected, and chaos erupted with frightening speed, doors thrown open, feet pounding down hallways, orders shouted over one another in rising panic, and still, amid the sudden noise, the girl remained silent, standing at the edge of the corridor, watching as smoke thickened and light flickered wildly against the walls, casting shadows that twisted and stretched as if trying to escape their own shapes. The heat intensified quickly, the air growing heavy and difficult to breathe, sparks snapping and popping as beams began to catch, and people ran past her without seeing her, too consumed by fear to notice the quiet figure standing perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the flames, with an expression that was not terror but recognition, as though she had been waiting for this moment without ever knowing it. The house reacted violently to the fire, groaning and shuddering as though wounded, its sounds no longer passive creaks but sharp, agonized cries, and the girl felt those vibrations travel through the floor and into her bones, resonating with the pressure she had carried inside herself for years. The words packed tight within her chest, responding to the crackle and roar, with a pull that felt almost magnetic. Smoke billowed, stinging eyes and throats, making people cough and shout. And still she made no sound, though her chest burned with the effort of holding back not fear but something else entirely, something that pressed upward with every breath, demanding release, as flames spread along the corridor, consuming curtains and licking at door frames. The girl stepped forward for the first time, drawn closer to the heat, and those who noticed her movement shouted at her to retreat, to save herself, but she did not look at them, did not acknowledge their words, because her attention was fixed on the way the fire moved, purposeful and eager, as if it was searching, responding to the unseen currents of the house, and she felt deep within her that the fire was not simply destroying but uncovering, burning away layers that had been built up over years of silence and denial. A beam collapsed with a thunderous crack nearby, sending a shower of sparks across the floor, and the girl did not flinch, standing firm as embers skittered around her feet, the heat washing over her face, and in that moment she inhaled deeply, the smoke filling her lungs, her throat tightening, and something shifted irrevocably inside her, the restraint she had maintained for so long beginning to fracture under the combined pressure of fear, heat, and the overwhelming sense that the time for silence had ended. The house seemed to sense it too, the flames surging higher as if encouraged, shadows dancing wildly, doors slamming shut or bursting open with explosive force, and the noise rose to a deafening roar that swallowed individual voices whole. Yet beneath it all, there was a strange clarity, a still point at the center of the chaos where the girl stood, her body trembling not with panic but with effort, holding back a sound that now felt too large to contain. People scrambled for exits, some trapped by fallen beams or thick smoke, others frozen in place by confusion and fear, and amid their shouting and coughing, the girl's silence became more conspicuous than ever, a void at the heart of the storm, and as she opened her mouth, not to scream, not yet, but simply to breathe, The air seemed to pause around her, the flames flickering uncertainly as if waiting for instruction, and in that suspended moment, with the house burning and the past pressing in from every direction, it became clear that this fire was not merely an ending but a threshold, the first visible crack in a structure built on enforced quiet, and whatever crossed that threshold would do so with a force that no one inside those walls was prepared to face. In that suspended moment, when the house seemed to hold its breath alongside her, and the flames flickered as if uncertain of their next move, the girl finally let the silence loosen its grip, not all at once, not explosively, but with a deliberate surrender that felt older than fear, older even than obedience. And when her voice emerged, it did not tear free like a scream, but flowed out in a steady, unwavering tone that cut through the roar of the fire with unsettling clarity. A single sentence spoke, on calmly amid chaos, so unexpected and so precise that it froze movement around her, turning panic into shock, because no one had ever heard her speak before, not a whisper, not a cry, and the sound of her voice carried a weight that did not match her slight frame, resonant and grounded, as though it had been waiting years for the right moment to exist. People stumbled to a halt mid-run, coughing, eyes wide, some turning slowly as if afraid of what they might see, others backing away instinctively, and the fire itself seemed to respond, flaring brighter for an instant, before settling into a low, steady burn. As though acknowledging her presence, she spoke again, louder now. And this time her words were not vague or accidental but precise, naming things that made faces drain of color, calling out truths that had lived only in whispers and shadows, details no one had ever said aloud, moments of cruelty disguised as discipline, of silence mistaken for righteousness, of harm buried beneath routine and authority, and with each truth spoken, the house reacted violently, beams groaning as if under sudden strain, walls cracking open with sharp reports, sparks bursting outward in time with her words, as though the structure itself could no longer bear the weight of what was being revealed. Those who had enforced her silence recoiled first, their shouts faltering, their commands dissolving into incoherent noise, because the power they had held depended on her quiet, on the assumption that what was unspoken could never be challenged. And now, with every measured sentence she released, that power eroded, flaking away like charred wood. She did not shout over the fire, but spoke through it, her voice threading between the crackle and roar, unwavering despite the smoke clawing at her lungs, despite the heat blistering her skin, and the effort of holding herself steady amid such destruction took everything she had, her body trembling, knees threatening to buckle. Yet still she spoke, because stopping now felt more dangerous than continuing, as if silence, once broken, could never be safely reclaimed. The words poured out not in a rush but in a sequence, each one chosen with terrifying certainty, and as she named names and moments and buried acts, people cried out, denying, pleading, begging her to stop, but their voices sounded thin and fragile against hers, stripped of authority, reduced to noise, and the fire answered her again, surging where guilt was thickest, collapsing ceilings where lies had layered most heavily, guiding destruction with an almost deliberate hand. Someone tried to reach her then, grabbing at her arm in desperation, but the heat forced them back, a wall of flame rising between them as if in defense, and she continued, eyes fixed not on any single person, but on the house itself, as though addressing the structure that had held her silence for so long, telling it everything it already knew but had never been allowed to release. Smoke filled the corridors, thick and choking, alarms of pain and terror echoing through the space. Yet her voice remained clear, cutting through it all. And in that clarity there was no malice, no vengeance, only truth delivered without apology, without restraint. The accumulated weight of years of listening finally given form. The house responded as if relieved, its groans deepening into something like a sigh, walls giving way more readily now, beams collapsing in controlled chaos, and for the first time since the fire began, there was a sense of inevitability rather than panic, as if the destruction unfolding was not random but necessary, the natural consequence of too much being held for too long. Her voice faltered once, just once, as smoke burned her throat and her vision blurred, but she steadied herself, drawing strength not from the people around her, but from the release itself, from the knowledge that every word spoken lightened the burden she had carried alone, and when she finished, well, the final truth left her lips. There was a brief, profound silence, a gap in the chaos, where even the fire seemed to pause, and in that silence, the power that had sustained the house for so long finally broke, splintering under the weight of what could no longer be denied. In the wake of that brief, impossible silence, when her final words seemed to hang in the smoke like something solid enough to touch, the house did not erupt all at once but began to not silently now but attentively, absorbing their words without responding because she no longer needed to speak, her work already done, the silence she had carried finally emptied, and as the last of the roof began to give way, beams crashing down in a rain of sparks and smoke, the house let out a sound unlike any it had made before, a deep, resonant crack that traveled through the ground itself, felt rather than heard, like a final breath released after too long held, and in that moment, the structure ceased to be a house at all, becoming instead a collapsing monument to everything it had contained. When the final supports failed, and the flames roared upward in a blinding surge, the girl was lost from sight amid the smoke and falling debris, and whether she fell, escaped, or became something else entirely, no one could later agree, because those who survived stumbled out into the night half blind and shaken, carrying with them not just burns and scars, but the unbearable certainty that they had witnessed something that could not be undone, something that had stripped away the illusion of control and replaced it with truth laid bare, and as the fire consumed what remained, reducing years of enforced silence to ash and embers, the truth continued to burn long after the flames themselves began to die. When the fire finally ebbed and the smoke began to thin, revealing the skeletal remains of a house that had once held so much control, so much quiet suffering, the world outside seemed impossibly still, as if it too were recovering from a shock too vast to process. Survivors staggered from the ruin, coughing, eyes red and raw from smoke, clothes charred, skin blistered, some screaming in confusion, some silently weeping, but all sharing the same unspoken knowledge that the order they had relied upon for years, the strict hierarchy, the silence imposed as law, the illusion of mastery over one another and over the girl who had never spoken, was gone, vanished with the collapse of walls and ceilings, and in its place was a clarity that no one could escape. They looked around at the wreckage, at beams blackened and twisted into impossible angles, at furniture reduced to ash, at the floors cracked open like paper under pressure, and every corner seemed to whisper truths that had been held in silence for decades, truths that now no one could ignore. Some of the survivors tried to account for the girl, calling her name into the emptiness, hoping for a glimpse of her among the rubble. But she was gone, not just missing, not simply vanished into the smoke, gone in a way that suggested she had become part of something larger than herself, a force intertwined with the collapse of the house, with the revelation of its secrets, a presence that would no longer be contained. There were whispers then, fragile, tremulous, starting at the edges of the group and spreading like wind through trees. Some claimed they had seen her move through the collapsing beams, guiding others, moving with a certainty no one could follow, and then vanish. Others insisted they had heard her voice in the crackling of the fire, in the sigh of collapsing wood, in the way the wind carried ash through the air, and though they could not pinpoint her form, they were certain she had been there, not just as a witness but as an active force, shaping the final moments of the house's destruction with the very power that had been denied her for so long. The survivors began to speak among themselves, attempting to make sense of what they had seen, to piece together a narrative that could explain the impossible, but every story diverged, some insisting she had been human and mortal, others claiming she was something beyond understanding, a spirit born from years of enforced silence, and in the absence of certainty, fear and awe intertwined, creating a collective memory that was as fragile as it was indelible. People touched the remnants of walls, running their hands over scorched wood, feeling the grooves of ancient beams that had once supported ceilings, imagining the quiet that had existed there for so many years, and realized with a shiver that the silence had been more than absence, It had been a living force, compressing itself around her, compressing her thoughts and desires, shaping her into something that could survive, endure, and finally unleash a truth so absolute that the structure itself had been forced to yield. Among the ruins, some began to uncover hidden spaces, the remnants of compartments and closets that had been sealed for years, discovering the objects stored within, the notes, the personal effects, the evidence of a household built on secrecy and fear. And each discovery seemed to resonate with her voice, as if the girl had spoken them into awareness, even in the absence of sound, and the fire had only made them visible. As word spread beyond the walls of that house, the tale took on a life of its own, carried into nearby towns, whispered at markets, and recounted by travelers who passed the ruined site. The story becoming legend, not merely of a fire, but of a girl who had been denied speech, and yet had changed everything by finding her voice at the precise moment the world demanded it. Families told their children to remember the girl, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a symbol of endurance and revelation, a reminder that silence is powerful, but truth, once spoken, is unstoppable. Those who had survived began to notice that they remembered her words even when they tried not to, phrases repeating themselves in their minds unbidden, carrying moral weight, emotional clarity, and the painful awareness of past complicity, and they realized that the silence of years had been a storehouse of knowledge, of observation, of truths that could not be fully destroyed, even when the house had burned to the ground. Some believed that she had perished in the fire, consumed by the same flames that had unveiled the house's secrets, and those stories carried their own gravity, because to perish in that way, at that exact moment, gave meaning to the years she had spent silent. Others insisted she had survived, escaping the wreckage, perhaps carrying with her the fire's lessons, the house's truth, the weight of voices silenced for so long, and would one day speak again in another place, under other walls, bringing with her the same revelation, the same unstoppable truth, and regardless of which version one chose to believe, the survivors all felt the same reverence and fear toward her memory, because she had fundamentally altered the way they understood authority, obedience, and the consequences of enforced silence. As people sifted through the ashes, they began to piece together fragments of what had occurred, noticing how the fire had seemed selective, destroying some things while leaving others oddly intact, and some whispered that it had been guided, not purely by chance, but by the girl herself, her voice influencing the very elements, directing the fire to reveal hidden truths, punish cruelty, and spare the innocent, and whether or not one accepted that as fact, the perception alone carried power, reshaping the survivors' understanding of what they had endured. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, yet no one forgot the events, and the site of the ruined house became a place of pilgrimage, caution, and fascination, drawing those who had heard the story and those who sought to witness its remnants firsthand. Each visitor experienced the oppressive sense of the girl's presence lingering there, in the scorched beams, in the ash-strewn floors, in the air that seemed to tremble with her memory, and even those who did not believe in the supernatural felt the weight of long-enforced silence, of truths too long hidden, pressing against them, reminding them that some histories cannot be fully contained. Over time, the tale of the girl who had never spoken until the night the house burned spread far beyond, indeed the local area, carried in whispers, letters, and eventually printed accounts, each storyteller embellishing slightly, adding elements that heightened the tension, the horror, or the miraculous nature of her voice. And in this way, the story grew into a legend, a warning about the dangers of silencing those with knowledge, the impossibility of controlling truth, and the unexpected power of one voice when it finally breaks free from chains unseen. In communities across the region, parents would caution their children to listen carefully to those around them, to consider the cost of cruelty and secrecy, and the girl became both symbol and memory, a reminder that silence enforced over years accumulates like a weight that must eventually be borne, and when it is released, it can reshape not only individual lives, but entire households, entire societies, entire understandings of what is just and what is inevitable. And though she was gone, whether in body, spirit, or memory, the story endured, and the moral it carried could not be ignored. When truth is suppressed, it does not vanish. It waits, quietly, patiently, gathering force until it finds the moment to speak, to reveal, to transform everything it touches. And in that transformation, the survivors, the witnesses, and the storytellers themselves became forever changed, haunted by the knowledge that they had lived alongside a force beyond comprehension, a girl who had been silenced for years and yet had claimed her voice precisely when it was most needed, leaving behind a world that could no longer return to the comfort of ignorance. And so, in the aftermath of the fire, the girl's presence lingered like a shadow stretched across the charred remains of the house, not in form but in memory, in resonance, in the echoes of a voice that had been denied for so long and had finally, irrevocably, broken free. Survivors, some still clutching remnants of what they had carried through the flames, looked around at the ruin with disbelief, each corner of the house telling a story in blackened beams, scorched floorboards, and splintered walls, and it became immediately clear that this was no ordinary fire, no random tragedy, but the material evidence of a reckoning long overdue, an upheaval orchestrated by a force that had been silent for 17 years, whose power had been underestimated at every turn. The air still smoldered with heat, carrying the faint scent of ash and something deeper, almost metallic, a reminder that what had been contained had finally been released, and those who remained could feel it pressing against their chest, a physical weight of accountability that no apology, no frantic explanation could lift. Some of the survivors claimed they had glimpsed her in the collapsing beams, moving with a certainty they could not follow, guiding the fire in precise and deliberate ways, and then vanishing. Others said that the fire itself seemed to ling. The tale acquired layers, and some even suggested that the girl had become more than human, that she was something like the voice of justice itself, appearing at the moment the scales demanded balance, her enforced silence having sharpened her understanding of cruelty, deceit, and human weakness into something almost supernatural. Even in regions far from the site, people spoke in hushed tones about the girl who had never spoken until the fire, warning children and neighbors alike. Silence may seem passive, but it can accumulate, grow, and one day erupt with a force that reshapes everything in its path, and those who witness it are forever changed. The survivors themselves struggled with the aftermath, wrestling with memories that seemed almost physical, recalling the precise cadence of her voice, the way it carried across the burning hallways, the way each word corresponded to destruction and revelation, the way the fire seemed alive, attuned to truth, almost intelligent in its chaos. Many could not sleep for weeks, haunted by the realization that they had been complicit in maintaining a system of oppression, even unintentionally, and that her voice had revealed what silence could not contain, the full weight of accountability. They looked at one another and remembered moments that had seemed insignificant before, harsh words left unspoken, secrets ignored, cruelty rationalized, and now those small decisions loomed large, magnified by the power of one who had endured years of enforced silence. Some could not bring themselves to discuss what they had seen because speaking of it seemed impossible, the events so beyond ordinary experience that they felt like nightmares given form. Yet in the midst of fear and awe, there was also reverence. The girl, though absent, became an invisible guide, a symbol of resilience and inevitable truth, a reminder that enforced silence does not erase knowledge. It stores it, compresses it, amplifies it, until the moment it must be released. People visited the ruins over the following months, standing among the charred beams and ash-covered floors, breathing the thick air heavy with memory, and they felt her presence, not as a haunting, but as a lingering demand, remember. Witness. Learn. The air itself seemed to hold the resonance of her voice, carrying it in a whisper that could be heard by those sensitive to what had occurred, and in those whispers, people found both warning and inspiration. Communities far and near debated what had happened, struggling to reconcile human agency with something that felt almost divine, and in doing so, they began to examine their own structures of authority, the ways they silenced, dismissed, and controlled those deemed powerless. And the story of the girl became a touchstone for morality, accountability, and courage. Every version emphasized the same point. She had been denied speech, stripped of agency, and yet, when the moment arrived, she became unstoppable. And her voice, precise, deliberate, and unstoppable, reshaped the lives of all who witnessed it. Even generations later, parents told their children of the girl who had been silent until the fire, warning them that silence can be a weapon, a prison, and a seed of transformation all at once, and that the consequences of enforced suppression could manifest in ways unimaginable. Some historians and chroniclers attempted to separate fact from legend, scrutinizing reports, interviewing survivors, and examining the ruins, yet even their most objective accounts acknowledged one truth. Something extraordinary had occurred that night, and it could not be explained purely by fire or accident. It demanded recognition that silence, repression, and unseen suffering can carry power far beyond what is visible or immediately understood. Scholars debated whether the girl had survived physically, whether she had vanished into the night, or whether her voice had transcended human limitation, becoming a mythic fork. Tied to the revelations of the house itself. Regardless of interpretation, the impact on society was undeniable. People reconsidered what it meant to listen, to witness, to allow truth to remain hidden or speak freely, and the story became a reminder that enforced silence is never neutral. By the time the embers cooled completely, the girl's legacy had taken root in the consciousness of everyone connected to the event, shaping perceptions of justice, oppression, and power. The fire had not merely destroyed a building, it had exposed the fragile structures upon which authority and compliance rested, and it had given form to the potential of one voice, long suppressed, to alter reality in ways unimaginable. Survivors and later generations carried that memory, understanding that silence is not empty, that listening can be dangerous, and that the moment truth is released, consequences follow with inevitable force. And so, if this story has unsettled you, captivated you, or reminded you of the power hidden in words unspoken, subscribe to History Unmasked, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment below telling us how deeply this story impacted you, because the lesson is timeless. Silence, when enforced, does not destroy knowledge. It preserves it, amplifies it, and when released, it can reshape the world in ways that no one expects. And the girl who had never spoken until the fire will continue to remind us of that truth, haunting the memory of those who dare to ignore it, and inspiring those brave enough to listen.